Jesus Freak here. So, I had a conversation on a YouTube video where someone was basically saying the same thing I say about Isaiah 14, and although he did admit that there's a possible secondary interpretation which has to do with the whole idea of types, or I'd be more likely to say a prototypes, or I forgot the word I was going to use, but I was thought it out earlier. For example, maybe I guess and someone got into the usual conversation about God said he'd protect his words in the King James Version because it's 7 times purified, because Psalm 12:7. And I've said the same thing I say. I told the guy, that verse doesn't mean what you think it means. He said, and what poor version of the Bible did you get that idea from? I said, from the King James. And I went and explained where I was coming from. But this is that usual King James ugly that Pastor Brett talks about. It's basically echoing Gail and God and Ripplinger. And I mentioned, of course, that the whole idea of using Psalm 12:7 that way comes from the Seventh-day Adventists. It's just an example among many of King James Onlyists not caring who they fellowship with as long as it's someone else who's King James Onlyist. And, they'll fellowship with all sorts of heretics and people who believe in false doctrines just because they're willing to accept the King James Bible to the exclusion of all others. Now, they're going to say, the King James Version says, the words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. I said, look, first, the second them in verse 7 isn't referring to what you think it is. The King James translators said that them should be understood as a him. As in, it's referring to people, not things. So that words cannot be the antecedent of that them. So what is the antecedent? It's poor and needy in verse 5. So what words are being mentioned here? If you take it in context, it's not talking about Scripture. It's talking about specifically verse 5. They're saying, look, because God's words are pure, because he always keeps his promises, I know that when you say, I'll protect the poor and needy, you'll do it. That's what that verse is actually saying. When you take the verse in its proper context, the meaning is completely different. It's about having faith that God will do what he said he would. And it's interesting that it came up when it did, because that's what the whole book of Jonah is about, and that's what we covered today. Anyway, like I said, I didn't use anything but a KJV to come to that conclusion. I said, look, when you take the words in context, then you're rightly dividing Scripture. But when you take them out of context, you're coming up with all sorts of wild theories that the words don't support. And Paul makes his big bones about, rightly dividing the words of Scripture. Now, the whole prototypes and for examples thing, it's like, yeah, I'm willing to say, hey, I don't really buy the thing, but, I have to say it's got to be true, because Paul says it is. And goes into this whole multiple chapter long spiel about how it's true. And if he's doing this under the influence of God, well, it's got to be true. And I think even Peter talked about it when he was talking about, and I can't remember where this passage was, but there was a passage where Noah's Ark was compared to baptism as a for example of baptism. Or as you Presbyterians would say, a type of baptism. I don't like to use the word type because people would think I'm saying something I ain't. Like if I said, Nehushtan was a type of Christ, which, in the sense that the word is used in these circles, in Reformed circles, that's true. The idea of Nehushtan being fixed on a pole, lifted up, and people looking to it for healing, versus Christ being nailed on a cross. I don't care what Jehovah's Witnesses say that he was just put on a wooden pole. He was put on a cross. And people look to him being lifted up on the cross for healing. Now, most people are going to say, if I say that it's a type of Christ, that I'm calling Nehushtan Christ. I'm not. That's why I say he was a for example. An example that went before. Which Jesus is the more full exemplar, to which these things were partial exemplars. So I'm willing to say, yeah, it's possible. But if we're going to say, oh, this verse means this because that's what everyone knows it means. No. We believe this is true, but we can't use that verse to justify it. At some point, we have to say that some of the things we believe, we don't necessarily believe because that's actually what Scripture says. We believe them because of traditions. Now, I'm not denying that God's words are pure and that He will keep them. All I'm saying is that's not what that verse is saying. And if you read it in its proper context, that's not the conclusion you'll come to. That's what rightly dividing the word of truth is. Jesus freak out.